Jamal thought he had found a new start when he transferred to Westbrook Academy, an elite school in a wealthy suburb. But as one of the few black students in a sea of privilege and power, he quickly becomes a target. Relentless bullying and a cruel prank push him to the brink, leaving him fighting for his life. Now, with his loving adoptive parents by his side, Jamal is determined to expose the truth. But Tyler Anderson, the ringleader of his tormentors, has a powerful father willing to do whatever it takes to keep his son's reputation clean, even if it means silencing Jamal for good. As secrets unravel, the Thompsons uncover a history of cover-ups and corruption that reaches deep into the school's administration. With time running out and powerful enemies closing in, the family must decide how far they're willing to go to protect their son and get justice for those who have been silenced. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. Jamal stood at the entrance of the prestigious Westbrook Academy, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and anxiety. The imposing brick building, with its perfectly manicured lawns and towering oak trees, looked like something out of a brochure. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where he could prove himself and make new friends. But as he took his first step onto the school grounds, the sea of unfamiliar faces staring back at him made him feel more like an outsider than ever. Jamal was painfully aware of the fact that he was one of the few black students in the entire school. He tried to shake off the feeling, reminding himself of what his adoptive parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, had told him that morning. "You belong here just as much as anyone else," Mrs. Thompson had said, squeezing his shoulder. "Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." But as he walked through the crowded hallways, the reality of those words felt harder and harder to believe. He could hear whispers and see eyes lingering on him longer than was comfortable. He told himself it was just first-day jitters and pushed on, determined not to let it bother him. The bell rang, signaling lunch, and Jamal decided to head to the cafeteria. He scanned the room, hoping to spot a friendly face, someone he could sit with. But the tables were full of groups already formed, laughing and chatting as if they'd known each other for years. Swallowing his pride, he chose an empty corner table and sat down, pulling out the lunch his mom had lovingly packed for him. As he took a bite of his sandwich, he tried to focus on his phone, pretending not to notice the occasional glances in his direction. Just as he started to relax, 3 boys approached his table, towering over him. He recognized one of them from his first-period class, Tyler, with his perfectly styled blonde hair and expensive sneakers. The 2 others, Bryce and Logan, flanked him like loyal henchmen. "Hey, new kid," Tyler said, flashing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What's your name again?" "Jamal, right?" Jamal nodded cautiously, trying to gauge their intentions. "Yeah, that's me." "Nice to meet you," Tyler continued, his voice dripping with insincerity. "How are you liking our school so far?" "It's fine," Jamal replied, keeping his answers short. He could sense something was off, but he wasn't sure where this was going. "Well, since you're new here, we thought we'd give you a warm welcome," Bryce added, his tone mocking. Before Jamal could respond, Tyler's hand shot out, slapping Jamal's lunch tray off the table. The sandwich, apple slices, and juice carton scattered across the floor. The cafeteria went silent for a moment, then erupted into laughter. Jamal's cheeks burned with humiliation as he dropped to his knees, trying to gather the remnants of his lunch. The laughter grew louder, and someone even pulled out their phone to record the scene. As Jamal struggled to pick up the pieces, Bryce casually stuck out his foot, tripping Jamal and sending him sprawling onto the floor. The crowd's laughter reached a fever pitch. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he just lay there, staring at the linoleum tiles, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "Oops, looks like you tripped," Logan said with a grin, his voice filled with mock concern. "Better watch your step, new kid." Jamal slowly pushed himself to his feet, biting his lip to keep from saying something that would only make things worse. He could feel all eyes on him, the entire cafeteria watching and waiting to see how he would react. But he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break down. He took a deep breath, grabbed his scattered lunch bag, and walked out of the cafeteria with his head held high, even as the jeers and taunts followed him. The walk down the hallway felt like a mile, every step heavier than the last. By the time he reached the boys' bathroom, he locked himself in one of the stalls, letting out a shaky breath. He leaned against the cold metal of the stall door, closing his eyes to fight back the tears that threatened to spill over. He couldn't let them win. He couldn't let them see him cry. He had to be strong, just like his parents always told him. But in that moment, alone in the bathroom, all he felt was defeat. At home that evening, Jamal's adoptive parents could sense that something was wrong. Mrs. Thompson watched as Jamal picked at his dinner, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced with a quiet, distant look. "Hey, sweetie," she said gently. "How was your first day? Make any new friends?" Jamal forced a smile, pushing the mashed potatoes around on his plate. "Yeah, it was okay. Just a lot to take in." Mr. Thompson exchanged a worried glance with his wife. "If something's bothering you, you know you can talk to us, right?" Jamal nodded, but he didn't trust himself to speak. He didn't want to burden them with his problems, not after everything they'd done for him. They had given him a home, a new life, a second chance. He couldn't let them down by showing them how weak he felt. "It's really fine, Dad," Jamal finally said, forcing a grin. "Just need to get used to the new place." But as he climbed into bed that night, the events of the day replayed in his mind. The laughter, the humiliation, the feeling of being utterly alone. For the first time in years, Jamal cried himself to sleep. The sun barely peeked over the horizon as Jamal trudged through the front doors of Westbrook Academy the next morning. He kept his head down, hoping to avoid the cruel glares and mocking whispers that had followed him yesterday. His stomach was a tight knot of anxiety, and he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him like a heavy fog. He tried to stay invisible, moving quickly through the crowded hallways toward his first class. But as he approached his locker, he noticed something was off. His locker door was slightly ajar, even though he was sure he had closed it securely the day before. Hesitantly, Jamal pulled it open and felt his heart drop. Scrawled in thick, black marker across the inside of the door was a crude drawing and the words, "Go back where you came from." A wave of nausea hit him as he stared at the hateful graffiti. He wanted to slam the door shut and pretend he hadn't seen it, but the damage was already done. A group of students passing by snickered as they glanced at his locker. Jamal clenched his fists, willing himself not to react. He couldn't let them see how much it hurt. Swallowing his pride, he grabbed his books and headed to his next class, trying to shake off the anger gnawing at his gut. He couldn't afford to let these people get to him. He needed to stay focused, especially since he had gym class today, a period he was dreading after what had happened in the cafeteria. The gymnasium was buzzing with noise as students changed into their athletic clothes. Jamal stayed in the far corner of the locker room, keeping to himself. He quickly changed into his gym uniform, praying that no one would notice him. But of course, he wasn't that lucky. Tyler, Bryce, and Logan sauntered over, their voices loud and filled with laughter. Jamal stiffened, pretending to be engrossed in tying his shoelaces, but it was no use. "Hey, loser," Bryce called out, his voice carrying across the locker room. "Surprised you came back after yesterday. Thought we scared you off." Jamal gritted his teeth and tried to ignore them, but Tyler wasn't about to let him off so easily. He crouched down in front of Jamal, a cruel grin on his face. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue? Or are you too scared to say anything?" Logan leaned in closer, lowering his voice so only Jamal could hear. "Better watch your back today, new kid. We've got a little surprise planned for you." The trio laughed as they walked away, leaving Jamal feeling like a deer caught in the headlights. His heart was pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He wanted to run out of the gym and never come back, but he forced himself to stay. He couldn't let them scare him away. Not again. During gym class, the students were split into teams for a game of dodgeball. Jamal tried to stay out of the way, focusing on avoiding the flurry of balls flying across the court. But it wasn't long before Tyler and his friends set their sights on him. Bryce hurled the first ball directly at Jamal's head. It struck him hard on the side of his face, making his vision blur for a moment. The impact sent him stumbling backward, but before he could recover, another ball hit him square in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The gym teacher blew his whistle, but only to encourage the players to keep the energy up. Jamal struggled to stay on his feet, blinking back tears as Tyler's team continued to target him. The other students were either laughing or simply looking away, pretending not to notice the abuse. "Oops, sorry, didn't see you there," Tyler sneered as he threw another ball, this time hitting Jamal's legs and sending him to the ground. Jamal's palms scraped against the rough floor, and he bit back a cry of pain. As he tried to get up, Tyler leaned down, whispering so only Jamal could hear. "You don't belong here. You'll never belong here." Jamal's vision blurred with tears, but he refused to let them fall. He wouldn't give Tyler the satisfaction. With a deep breath, he pulled himself up, his knees shaking but his resolve hardening. The gym teacher finally called the game, oblivious or indifferent to the obvious bullying. After class, Jamal hurried to the locker room, hoping to leave before Tyler and his friends could corner him again. But as he reached for his bag, he realized it was missing. Panic set in as he frantically searched the lockers around him. He finally found it in the trash can at the far end of the room, covered in spilled juice and crumpled paper towels. His gym clothes were soaked, and his textbooks were ruined. His hands trembled as he tried to salvage what he could, but it was useless. Everything was destroyed. Tyler's mocking laughter echoed through the locker room as Jamal fought back the tears threatening to spill over. "Oops, looks like someone's a little messy," Tyler taunted as he walked past, high-fiving Bryce and Logan. Jamal shoved his ruined belongings into his backpack and rushed out of the gym, his vision blurred with anger and frustration. He had to get away before he did something he would regret. The last thing he needed was to get into trouble on top of everything else. By the time he got home, Jamal was emotionally and physically drained. His parents noticed the bruises on his face and the state of his soaked backpack, but he brushed off their questions with a weak smile. "It's nothing," he insisted, his voice hollow. "Just gym class." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed with concern, but she didn't push. "Jamal, if something's happening at school." "I said it's fine, Mom," he snapped, instantly regretting the harshness in his voice. "I just need to shower and do my homework." He retreated to his room, closing the door behind him. As he stood under the hot water in the shower, he let the tears he'd been holding back finally fall. The water couldn't wash away the shame and pain he felt inside. All he wanted was to fit in, to belong somewhere. But it seemed like no matter what he did, he would always be on the outside looking in. Jamal dried off and stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The bruises on his face were already turning a sickly shade of purple. He touched them gingerly, wincing at the pain. "I have to survive this," he whispered to himself, clenching his fists. "I have to be strong." But deep down, he wondered how much more he could take before he broke completely. Jamal tried to stay out of everyone's way as the days went by. The cafeteria was a battlefield he had to navigate daily. He learned to eat quickly and quietly, his eyes constantly scanning the room for any signs of trouble. Today, however, he was tired of hiding. He decided to face the day with his head held a little higher, even if it was just to prove to himself that he was stronger than they thought. He grabbed his tray of food and cautiously made his way to a corner table. It was his usual spot, far enough from the other students to avoid being noticed, yet close enough to make a quick exit if necessary. He kept his head down as he ate, trying to ignore the occasional laughter and whispers he heard from the tables around him. But he wasn't alone for long. Jamal's heart sank as Tyler, Bryce, and Logan approached his table. The trio swaggered over, their smug grins signaling trouble. He could feel the eyes of the cafeteria turning toward them, the familiar feeling of dread settling in his stomach. "Hey, new kid," Tyler said, leaning against the table with a mocking smile. "Still eating all by yourself? That's pretty sad." Jamal gritted his teeth but kept his eyes on his food. "I'm just trying to eat. Leave me alone." "Oh, don't be like that," Bryce chimed in, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We just want to be friends, right, Logan?" "Yeah," Logan added with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Friends." Before Jamal could react, Tyler made a show of knocking Jamal's cup of juice off the table, spilling it onto the floor. Jamal's hands clenched into fists under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. He couldn't afford to get into more trouble. "That was an accident," Tyler said with a mock apology, wiping imaginary dust from his hands. "But don't worry, we brought you something better." Jamal frowned, confused. Bryce pulled something small from his pocket and quickly slipped it into Jamal's lunch when no one else was looking. The group burst into snickers as they walked away, leaving Jamal puzzled and on edge. Trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in his stomach, Jamal reluctantly continued eating his meal. He tried to convince himself that the boys were just trying to mess with his head, playing yet another cruel prank. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The taste of his food seemed a bit strange, but he was too exhausted to care. That night, Jamal sat in his room, trying to focus on his homework. But he couldn't shake the gnawing discomfort in his stomach. He assumed it was just the stress catching up with him, the relentless bullying, the constant fear of what would happen next. As he hunched over his desk, the pain in his stomach worsened. It came in sharp, stabbing waves that made him double over, clutching his midsection. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he tried to breathe through the pain, but it only got worse. Panic set in when he felt something shift inside his throat, an awful crawling sensation that sent chills down his spine. Jamal stumbled to the bathroom, clutching his stomach. He could feel his heartbeat thudding in his ears as he leaned over the sink, his breathing coming in ragged gasps. He gagged, trying to clear the sensation, but nothing came up. A few minutes later, the pain subsided enough for him to stand up straight. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to calm himself. "Get a grip," he whispered to himself. "It's just stress. You're fine." But as he turned off the faucet, he caught a glimpse of something in the corner of his eye, something moving. He froze, staring at the mirror. To his horror, he saw tiny, white larvae crawling out of the corner of his mouth. "No, no, no," he whispered, backing away from the sink, his heart pounding in his chest. He ran back to his bedroom, panic rising with every second. He grabbed his phone with trembling hands and tried to call his parents, but his vision blurred with tears, and he accidentally dropped it. The wriggling sensation continued, and now he felt it in his nose and ears. Jamal's scream tore through the quiet house as his parents burst into the room, panic etched on their faces. "What's happening?" Mrs. Thompson cried, rushing to her son's side. Mr. Thompson's face turned white as he saw the larvae emerging from Jamal's nose and ears. "Call 911, he shouted, trying to comfort his son, who was writhing in agony. The ambulance ride felt like an eternity. Jamal's screams filled the small space, and the paramedics were doing their best to stabilize him, but they were clearly shaken by what they were seeing. At the hospital, doctors worked frantically to extract the larvae and stop the infection. Mrs. Thompson clung to her husband, tears streaming down her face as they watched their son through the glass window of the emergency room. "What could have caused this?" she sobbed. "Who would do something like this to our boy?" Mr. Thompson's jaw clenched. Someone at that school did this to him. I don't know how, but they're going to pay for it. The doctors finally managed to stabilize Jamal, but the damage was done. His body was covered in red marks, and he had to be sedated to ease his pain. As the nurses wheeled him into a private room, Mr. Thompson's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to let this slide. Whoever did this would pay dearly. Back at Westbrook Academy, Tyler, Bryce, and Logan laughed as they watched a grainy phone video of Jamal being wheeled into the ambulance. Looks like he didn't handle our little surprise very well, Tyler sneered. Bryce grinned, patting Logan on the back. Told you he'd freak out. Serves him right for trying to act like he belongs here. But Logan's smile faltered as he watched the video again. For a brief moment, he saw the look of sheer terror in Jamal's eyes, and a small pang of guilt twisted in his gut. He shook his head, trying to push the feeling away. After all, it was just a prank, wasn't it? The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast a cold, sterile glow as Jamal lay unconscious on the bed. His skin was pale, and the sound of the heart monitor filled the room with an incessant beeping that grated on Mrs. Thompson's nerves. She stood by her son's side, clutching his limp hand, while Mr. Thompson paced back and forth, his mind racing. The doctors had managed to remove the larvae from Jamal's body, but they were still baffled by how the infestation had occurred. The lead physician, a stern-looking woman with tired eyes, approached the Thompsons with a grim expression. "We've managed to stabilize him for now," she said, her voice calm but heavy. "But the infection has spread through his nasal passages and throat. He'll need to stay under observation for a few days." Mrs. Thompson squeezed Jamal's hand tighter, her heart breaking at the sight of her son lying there, so vulnerable. "How did this happen?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "How did larvae get inside his body?" The doctor hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "We're not entirely sure, but we suspect it was something he ingested. Do you know if he might have eaten anything unusual recently?" Mr. Thompson's eyes darkened as he remembered Jamal's reluctance to talk about his time at school. "This wasn't an accident," he muttered under his breath, fists clenching. "Someone did this to him." Mrs. Thompson looked up at her husband, her face a mask of shock and horror. "You don't think? At school?" "It has to be," Mr. Thompson replied, his voice low and dangerous. "I knew something was wrong when he came home covered in bruises, but I didn't push hard enough. I should have done more." The doctor, sensing the tension, cleared her throat. "We'll continue to run tests to see if we can identify what exactly caused the larvae infestation. In the meantime, I suggest you get some rest. It's going to be a long night." Mrs. Thompson shook her head vehemently. "I'm not leaving his side." The doctor nodded understandingly before stepping out of the room, leaving the Thompsons to grapple with their fear and anger. As the hours dragged on, Jamal remained unconscious, his breathing shallow. Mrs. Thompson refused to leave his side, gently brushing his hair back and whispering words of comfort, even though she wasn't sure he could hear her. Mr. Thompson, on the other hand, couldn't sit still. He paced the room, his mind racing with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't shake the image of his son writhing in pain, larvae crawling out of his nose and ears. Whoever was responsible for this would pay. He pulled out his phone and began typing furiously, reaching out to anyone who might have connections with the school. If the administration wouldn't take responsibility, he would force them to. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. He would have to dig deeper to uncover the truth. A few hours later, Jamal stirred, his eyelids fluttering as he slowly regained consciousness. Mrs. Thompson leaned in closer, her heart leaping with relief. "Jamal, honey, can you hear me?" she asked softly, trying to keep her voice steady. Jamal's eyes blinked open, unfocused and glassy. His throat burned, and his head throbbed with pain. It took him a moment to recognize where he was. The harsh smell of antiseptic filled his nostrils, and he could hear the steady beeping of machines around him. "Mom?" His voice was a raspy whisper. What happened?" Tears filled Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she gently stroked his cheek. "You're in the hospital, sweetheart. You were really sick. But you're safe now." Jamal's mind was a blur. He tried to remember what had happened before everything went dark, but all he could recall was the searing pain and the awful sensation of something crawling inside him. The food," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "They put something in my food." "Mr. Thompson froze, his fists clenching at his sides. "Who did this to you, Jamal? Who put something in your food?" Jamal's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his father. "Tyler, and the others. I didn't see it, but I know it was them." Mrs. Thompson's face went pale as she listened to her son's words. "We're going to make sure they pay for this," she promised, her voice trembling with fury. "No one hurts our son and gets away with it." The next morning, Mr. Thompson stormed into the principal's office at Westbrook Academy. The secretary tried to stop him, but he pushed past her, slamming the door behind him. The principal, a stern-looking man with graying hair, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Thompson, what is the meaning of this?" the principal demanded, rising from his chair. "You know damn well why I'm here," Mr. Thompson snapped, throwing a folder onto the principal's desk. "My son is in the hospital because of your students, and I want to know what you're going to do about it." The principal glanced at the folder, which contained photos of Jamal's bruised face and the hospital report. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "I understand that you're upset, Mr. Thompson, but these are serious allegations. We can't just take action based on my son almost died," Mr. Thompson shouted, slamming his fists on the desk. "And you want to talk about procedures? I'm not leaving until you assure me that those boys will face consequences." The principal leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "We will, of course, conduct a thorough investigation, but until then, there's not much we can do." "You mean you won't do anything because their parents are donors?" Mr. Thompson growled, his voice low. "But I'm not backing down. If you don't handle this, I will." As Mr. Thompson stormed out of the office, he knew this was far from over. He would get justice for his son, even if it meant taking on the entire school board. Back in the hospital, Jamal lay in bed, his body aching and his mind racing with anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to him like a shadow. What if Tyler and his friends came after him again? What if they tried something worse? He turned to his mother, who was sitting by his side, holding his hand. "Mom, what if they don't stop?" Mrs. Thompson squeezed his hand tightly, her eyes fierce. "They won't get away with this, Jamal. I promise you. Your father and I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe." But even as she said the words, a knot of fear twisted in her stomach. She knew they were up against powerful families who would do anything to protect their own. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but they had no choice. They had to fight back, for Jamal's sake. The hospital's dim lights and sterile smell were a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside Mr. Thompson's mind. After his heated encounter with the principal, he returned to Jamal's hospital room, his anger barely contained. He stood at the window, staring out at the gray sky, while Mrs. Thompson sat by Jamal's bed, gently stroking their son's arm. "How did it go?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thompson turned to her, his expression dark. "Exactly how you'd expect. The principal doesn't want to do anything without proof, and kept talking about protecting the school's reputation." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flashed with anger. "Those boys almost killed our son. How can they ignore that?" "They don't care, Maria," Mr. Thompson said, his voice tight with frustration. "Their parents donate too much money to the school. The administration's more concerned about their donors than our son's life. Jamal stirred in his bed, the beeping of the monitors quickening. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around the room, still disoriented. Mrs. Thompson immediately leaned closer, her face softening. "Hey, honey, how are you feeling?" she asked, brushing a stray hair from his forehead. Jamal tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his throat made him wince. It still hurts," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Mr. Thompson's anger softened for a moment as he approached the bed. "Don't try to talk too much, son. Just rest." But Jamal's eyes were filled with pain and fear. Did they do anything?" he managed to ask, his voice raspy and weak. "The school, did they punish them?" Mr. Thompson hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Mrs. Thompson stepped in, her voice soothing. "We're working on it, sweetie. We're not going to let them get away with this." Jamal closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He felt so powerless, so vulnerable. He had always tried to stay strong, but this time, he wasn't sure he could. Later that evening, after Jamal had fallen asleep again, Mr. and Mrs. Thompson stepped outside the room to talk. The hallways were quiet, the only sound the soft hum of medical equipment in the distance. "We can't just sit back and wait, Mr. Thompson said, his voice filled with determination. "If the school won't take action, we have to force their hand." "But how?" Mrs. Thompson asked, her eyes red from crying. "We're just regular people. These families have power, connections. If we push too hard, they'll crush us." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, they won't. We have something they don't, truth. If we can find concrete evidence, we can take it to the media. Once the public knows what happened, the school will have no choice but to act." Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, a flicker of hope lighting her eyes. "But where do we even start? We don't have any proof. It's just Jamal's word against theirs." Mr. Thompson leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Jamal told us that one of those boys, Logan, looked guilty. Maybe he's our weak link. If we can get him to confess or at least give us something, we can use it." Mrs. Thompson frowned, thinking it over. "But how do we even reach him? He's one of them." "We have to find a way," Mr. Thompson insisted. "If Logan is feeling guilty, we might be able to persuade him to come forward. I'll start by trying to contact his parents." Mrs. Thompson looked uncertain, but she nodded. "Okay. Let's try it. We can't let this go." The next day, while Jamal rested at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson drove to the school. She was determined to confront the parents of the boys involved, even if it meant facing them alone. She marched into the school's administration office, demanding a meeting with the parents of Tyler, Bryce, and Logan. As she waited in the cold, sterile office, her mind raced. What would she say to them? How could she convince them to hold their sons accountable? The door finally opened, and three well-dressed couples walked in, their faces a mix of annoyance and condescension. The air was thick with tension as they took their seats around the small conference table. Mrs. Thompson could feel their eyes boring into her, but she refused to be intimidated. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves knotting in her stomach. "I'm here because your sons were involved in an incident that nearly killed my son, Jamal." One of the fathers, a tall man with a stern face, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You have no proof that our sons were involved. This is just a baseless accusation," he said dismissively. Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, fighting to keep her composure. "My son was found with larvae in his body. He's in the hospital right now, fighting off infections because of what your boys did. And I'm not leaving until you acknowledge that." A mother, dressed in an expensive blazer, scoffed. Your son is probably just trying to get attention. You people always want to play the victim. Mrs. Thompson's eyes blazed with fury. This isn't about playing the victim. This is about justice for my son. I don't care how much money you have or how powerful you think you are, I won't stop until your boys are held accountable. But the parents just exchanged smirks, clearly unmoved. Mrs. Thompson realized she was getting nowhere with them. She stood up, her voice cold and calm. Fine. If you won't listen, I'll take this public. I'll expose everything. Let's see how much your money can protect you then. As she stormed out of the office, she felt a mix of triumph and despair. She had stood her ground, but she still had no concrete evidence. She needed something more, something that would force the school to take action. And she knew exactly where to start. She needed to get Logan to talk. Back at the hospital, Mr. Thompson was sitting by Jamal's bed when his phone buzzed with a new message. He opened it to find an anonymous text that read, "Meet me at the park near the school at 6 p.m. I have something you need to know." He showed the message to Mrs. Thompson when she returned. "Do you think it's Logan?" she asked, her voice filled with a mix of hope and skepticism. "There's only one way to find out," Mr. Thompson said, grabbing his coat. "This might be the break we've been waiting for." Mrs. Thompson nodded, squeezing his hand. "Be careful." As Mr. Thompson hurried out the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. They were up against powerful families, a corrupt administration, and a system that was determined to protect its own. But he would stop at nothing to get justice for his son, no matter the cost. The cold evening air nipped at Mr. Thompson's face as he approached the small park near Westbrook Academy. It was almost dark, the sky painted in shades of deep blue and gray. The park was nearly deserted, save for the occasional dog walker and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Mr. Thompson's heart pounded as he checked his watch. It was just past 6 p.m. He glanced around nervously, unsure if he was walking into a trap. The anonymous text had been vague, and there was no guarantee it was from Logan or even someone with good intentions. But if there was a chance to get the truth, he had to take it. For Jamal's sake. A shadowy figure emerged from behind the cluster of trees at the far end of the park. As the figure stepped into the glow of a nearby street lamp, Mr. Thompson's shoulders relaxed slightly. It was Logan, the same boy Jamal had mentioned, the one who always seemed hesitant during the bullying. "Logan?" Mr. Thompson called, his voice low but urgent. The boy nodded and glanced around, his face pale and tense. "Yeah. Mr. Thompson, right?" He shifted nervously from foot to foot, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. "Yes. You said you have something to tell me." Mr. Thompson kept his tone calm, trying not to spook the teenager. He could see the fear in Logan's eyes. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't easy for him to face. Logan swallowed hard, his gaze darting around the park, making sure they were alone. I don't have much time," he stammered. "If Tyler and Bryce find out I'm talking to you, it'll be bad." Mr. Thompson nodded encouragingly. "You're doing the right thing. Whatever you have to say, it can help my son. Please, tell me what happened." Logan hesitated, his eyes shining with guilt. "I didn't want to do it," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But Tyler, he made me. He's the one who put the larval eggs in Jamal's food. Bryce and I just went along with it." Mr. Thompson's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Why would you do something like that?" he asked, his voice tight with anger and disbelief. Logan's eyes welled up with tears. "I don't know. I just didn't want to be the one they turned on next. Tyler, his dad is on the school board. He gets away with everything, and he makes sure we do too." Mr. Thompson's heart sank. It was worse than he'd imagined. So the school knows, he pressed. The administration is covering for them? Logan nodded quickly, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Yeah. Tyler's dad, Mr. Anderson, he told the principal to make it go away. They're trying to pin it on Jamal, saying he brought it on himself by being difficult. He paused, lowering his gaze in shame. I'm so sorry. I didn't think it would go this far. Mr. Thompson's stomach churned with a mix of rage and helplessness. Why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice softer. Logan hesitated again, looking down at his shoes. Because I saw the video, he confessed. The one Bryce took of Jamal being taken to the hospital. He looked like he was dying. I never wanted it to go that far. I just thought it was a stupid prank. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, his mind racing. This was it. The evidence they needed. Do you have the video? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Logan nodded, quickly pulling out his phone. He tapped a few times on the screen before holding it out to Mr. Thompson. Here. I got Bryce to send it to me. He doesn't know I kept a copy. Mr. Thompson's hands shook as he watched the grainy footage of his son writhing on the floor of the cafeteria, surrounded by students laughing and recording on their phones. He could barely watch it, but he knew it was the proof they needed. This is enough, Mr. Thompson said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Logan. You don't know how much this means to us. Logan nodded quickly, looking more nervous than ever. You can't tell anyone I gave it to you, he pleaded. If Tyler finds out, his dad will make my life hell. I understand, Mr. Thompson assured him. I'll protect you. But you did the right thing by coming forward. This video can bring justice for Jamal. Logan nodded, his expression a mix of relief and fear. I just want it to stop, he whispered. I don't want to hurt anyone else. Mr. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. You did the right thing tonight, Logan. Now go, before someone sees you. Logan gave a final, anxious glance around the park before turning and jogging away into the darkness. Mr. Thompson stood there for a moment, watching the boy disappear into the night. He couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. Logan had given them the evidence they needed, but this was far from over. Back at the hospital, Mrs. Thompson sat by Jamal's bed, reading softly to him from his favorite book. Jamal was awake, but he still looked pale and weak, his eyes distant. She stopped reading when she saw Mr. Thompson enter, a determined look on his face. Did you find anything? Mrs. Thompson asked, her voice barely concealing her desperation. Mr. Thompson nodded, holding up the phone. We have the video. It's enough to prove what they did. Logan gave it to me. Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she stood and wrapped her arms around her husband. Thank God, she whispered. Maybe now we can finally get justice. But even as she said the words, Mr. Thompson's jaw clenched. This isn't over, he said quietly. They're going to fight back. Tyler's father will do everything he can to protect his son. We need to be prepared. Mrs. Thompson nodded, her resolve hardening. We'll do whatever it takes, she said fiercely. No one hurts our son and gets away with it. Jamal listened quietly from his bed, his heart heavy with both gratitude and fear. His parents were fighting for him, but he knew that standing up to Tyler's family would be dangerous. And the thought of what might happen next terrified him. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the truth would finally come to light. Mr. Thompson leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen of his computer. The grainy video that Logan had provided was playing on a loop. The sight of his son writhing in agony while other students laughed and recorded it on their phones filled him with a rage he could barely contain. The evidence was damning, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to take down Tyler and his powerful father. They needed more, much more. Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway of their home office, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Any progress?" she asked, her voice weary but hopeful. "I'm trying," Mr. Thompson replied, rubbing his tired eyes. "We've got the video, but we need something stronger to force the school's hand. Logan's testimony won't hold up if he's too scared to come forward. Tyler's father will squash this the minute we try to make it public." Mrs. Thompson placed a mug in front of him and took a seat beside him. "What are you thinking?" she asked, her eyes scanning the dozens of tabs he had open on his computer screen. Mr. Thompson paused, then turned the screen to show her what he'd been researching. "I'm looking into other complaints against the school. If we can prove there's a pattern, other incidents that were swept under the rug, it could force the school board to act." Mrs. Thompson leaned closer, her eyes widening as she read through the reports he had pulled up. "But these are all old cases," she said, frowning. "How are we going to link them to what happened to Jamal?" "That's just it," Mr. Thompson replied, his eyes lighting up with determination. "I found a name that keeps coming up, Mr. Anderson, Tyler's father. He's been on the school board for years. Every time there's been an incident like this, he's somehow involved in covering it up." Mrs. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "So, this isn't the first time he's protected his son or someone close to him." "Exactly," Mr. Thompson said. "There was another student, a black boy, just like Jamal, who was bullied until he dropped out. The school hushed it up, and his family was paid off to stay silent." Mrs. Thompson's heart clenched as she listened. "What happened to that boy?" Mr. Thompson clicked on another link, bringing up a news article. "His name was Marcus Williams. He was in the same year as Tyler. According to the records I found, his parents filed a complaint about the bullying, but it went nowhere. A few months later, Marcus was found in his bedroom, a bottle of pills beside him." Mrs. Thompson's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. "Oh my God, they covered up a suicide?" "Yes," Mr. Thompson said grimly. "And they'll do it again if we don't stop them." The next morning, Mrs. Thompson drove to the address she had found for the Williams family. Her hands were shaking as she parked in front of the modest, weathered house. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door, hoping against hope that Marcus's parents would be willing to talk to her. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and a tired-looking woman with gray-streaked hair appeared. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes wary. "Mrs. Williams?" Mrs. Thompson asked softly. "I'm Maria Thompson. My son, Jamal, was attacked at Westbrook Academy, and I think what happened to him is connected to what happened to your son." The woman's eyes flickered with recognition, and she stepped aside to let Mrs. Thompson in. The house was small and sparsely furnished, with faded photographs lining the walls. Mrs. Williams led her into the living room and gestured for her to sit. "It's been years," Mrs. Williams said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "But I still think about Marcus every day. What happened to him, it didn't have to end that way." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her heart aching with empathy. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said quietly. "But I believe that the same people who covered up your son's case are trying to do it again with my son." Mrs. Williams sighed, sinking into a worn armchair. "We tried to fight back," she said, her voice cracking. "But the school board. Mr. Anderson, they were too powerful. They offered us money, told us it was best for everyone if we kept quiet." Mrs. Thompson leaned forward, her eyes burning with resolve. "Please, Mrs. Williams, we need your help. If we can prove that this isn't the first time they've done this, we can finally take them down." Mrs. Williams hesitated, her eyes filled with pain. "I can't bring Marcus back," she whispered. "But if it can stop another family from going through what we did, I'll help." Mrs. Thompson's heart lifted with hope. Do you have any documents, anything that can show what they did? Mrs. Williams nodded slowly. Marcus kept a journal. He wrote down everything that happened. I kept it all these years, hoping one day, maybe it would matter. She stood up, disappearing into the back of the house. When she returned, she held a tattered leather-bound journal in her hands. She handed it to Mrs. Thompson, her eyes shining with tears. "Take it," she said. "And make them pay." Back at the hospital, Mr. Thompson was sitting by Jamal's bedside when his phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Thompson. "I've got something big. Meet me at home." Jamal, who was awake but still weak, noticed the change in his father's expression. "Dad, what's going on?" Mr. Thompson leaned forward, placing a hand on Jamal's shoulder. "We might have found a way to expose them, son. Your mom is bringing some new evidence. We're going to make sure they can't hurt anyone else." Jamal's eyes were filled with a glimmer of hope. "Does this mean they'll pay for what they did?" Mr. Thompson nodded. "Yes. And this time, they won't be able to cover it up." When Mrs. Thompson arrived home, she immediately laid out the journal on the dining table. The entries were heartbreaking, detailed accounts of Marcus's bullying, the threats he faced, and the meetings with the school board where his complaints were dismissed. "This is it, Mr. Thompson said, flipping through the pages. "This is exactly what we need. If we can link this to what happened to Jamal, they won't be able to deny it. But we have to move quickly," Mrs. Thompson added. "Before they find out we have this." Mr. Thompson nodded. "I'll contact a journalist I know. If we can get this story out to the public, the school will be forced to act." Mrs. Thompson agreed, her eyes shining with determination. "They think they're untouchable, but they're about to learn that they can't bury the truth forever." As they prepared to take their next steps, Jamal watched from the hospital bed, feeling a renewed sense of strength. For the first time, it seemed like the darkness that had surrounded him for so long was starting to lift. But deep down, he knew that once they went public, there would be no turning back. The Andersons would not go down without a fight. And the real battle was just beginning. The Thompson household was unusually quiet, save for the occasional rustle of papers and the tapping of keyboards. The dining table was strewn with copies of Marcus Williams's journal entries, hospital reports, and printed screenshots of the video Logan had shared. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were deeply immersed in preparing their case, their faces lined with exhaustion. In the midst of all the chaos, Jamal sat in his room, staring blankly at his computer screen. The physical pain from his ordeal was starting to fade, but the emotional scars felt deeper than ever. He could hear his parents downstairs, whispering urgently about strategies and lawyers. They were fighting so hard for him, but all he could feel was guilt. "I'm the reason they're going through all this," he thought, his heart sinking. "If I hadn't insisted on going to that school, if I had just kept my head down, none of this would have happened." A knock on his door jolted him out of his thoughts. Mrs. Thompson entered, her expression softening when she saw her son's troubled face. "Hey, sweetheart," she said gently, sitting down on the edge of his bed. "How are you holding up?" Jamal shrugged, avoiding her eyes. "I'm okay," he muttered, though his voice betrayed his exhaustion. Mrs. Thompson reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "You don't have to be okay, Jamal. It's all right to be angry, to feel scared, after everything you've been through." Jamal's eyes filled with tears. He desperately tried to blink away. "I just feel like it's all my fault," he whispered. "You and Dad, you're going through so much because of me." Mrs. Thompson's heart broke at the pain in his voice. She leaned in and wrapped her arms around him. "None of this is your fault," she said fiercely. "You are a victim, Jamal. And we are fighting because we love you. We won't let them get away with this." But instead of being comforted, Jamal pulled away, frustration bubbling to the surface. "What if they don't stop?" he snapped. What if they come after you or Dad next? You don't know what people like Tyler's father can do. Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened. We're not afraid of them, she said firmly. They've been hiding behind their money and power for too long. It's time someone stood up to them. Jamal looked down, his hands trembling. He wanted to believe her, but deep down, he couldn't shake the fear that this battle would only lead to more suffering for his family. Later that evening, tensions reached a boiling point as the family gathered around the dining table to discuss their next steps. Mr. Thompson was on the phone with a journalist, trying to arrange a meeting to go public with their story. Mrs. Thompson was reviewing the journal entries, highlighting key passages that could support their case. Jamal, feeling overwhelmed and out of place, sat quietly in the corner, staring at the flickering candle on the table. The flames seemed to dance in time with his racing thoughts. Finally, unable to keep it in any longer, he burst out, "I don't want to do this anymore." His parents looked up in shock. Mrs. Thompson put down her highlighter, and Mr. Thompson ended his phone call abruptly. "What do you mean, Jamal?" his father asked, his voice filled with concern. Jamal stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I don't want to be your project, okay? I'm tired of all the meetings, the phone calls, the interviews. I just want it to stop." "Jamal, we're doing this for you," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice gentle but firm. "We need to make sure those boys are held accountable so they can't hurt anyone else." "But it's not just about me anymore, is it?" Jamal retorted, his voice rising. "You're trying to bring down the whole school. You don't care about how this is affecting me." Mrs. Thompson's face fell, tears welling up in her eyes. "That's not true, Jamal. We're trying to protect you." Mr. Thompson tried to step in, his voice calm but strained. "Son, we can't let them get away with this. They've done it before, and they'll do it again." Jamal shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "You're not listening to me. I don't want this. I just want to forget it ever happened." With that, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The sound reverberated through the house, leaving his parents standing in stunned silence. Mrs. Thompson collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I don't know if we're doing the right thing anymore," she whispered. "What if we're pushing him too hard?" Mr. Thompson placed a hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "We're doing what's best for him," he insisted, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "Jamal's scared, but we can't let fear control us. If we back down now, they'll think they've won." Upstairs, Jamal was curled up on his bed, sobbing quietly into his pillow. He felt like he was being torn in two. On one hand, he wanted his parents to succeed, to expose the school for its corruption and protect other kids like him. But on the other hand, he just wanted his life back. He was tired of being the victim, tired of being the center of this battle that seemed to have no end. As he lay there, the notification chime on his phone startled him. He hesitated, wiping his eyes before picking up the phone. It was a message from Logan. "Hey, are you okay? I heard your parents are going public. Please be careful. Tyler's dad is furious. I think they're planning something." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The last thing he wanted was for his parents to be targeted because of him. But how could he protect them? Another message came through from Logan. "If you want, I can help. I still have some stuff on Tyler and his dad that I didn't tell your dad about. But you have to promise not to let your parents get involved." Jamal's mind raced. This could be the answer, something he could do on his own, without dragging his parents further into the mess. He typed out a quick reply. "Okay. Let's meet tomorrow after school. And Logan, please, keep this between us." As he sent the message, Jamal's stomach churned with a mix of fear and determination. He had to find a way to end this, to protect his parents and finally put all of this behind him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that by keeping this secret, he was stepping into even more dangerous territory. Downstairs, Mrs. Thompson leaned into her husband's embrace, trying to find comfort in his presence. "We're losing him, Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can see it in his eyes. He's slipping away from us." Mr. Thompson tightened his hold on her, staring out into the darkened hallway where Jamal had disappeared. "We have to trust him," he said quietly, though the uncertainty gnawed at him. "We can't give up now. We're so close." But as the night stretched on, both parents were left wondering if, in their fight for justice, they were losing the one thing that mattered most, their son. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of the hospital room where Jamal lay, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. He hadn't slept well. The previous night's argument with his parents still echoed in his mind, and Logan's message about Tyler's father planning something dangerous gnawed at him. He knew he had to protect his family, even if it meant taking matters into his own hands. As Jamal tried to gather his thoughts, Mrs. Thompson entered with a forced smile and a tray of breakfast. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, setting the tray on the table beside his bed. "I made your favorite, pancakes and strawberries." Jamal gave a weak smile in return, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind was already racing with thoughts of how he would meet Logan that afternoon without his parents finding out. He pushed the food around on his plate, barely tasting it. Mrs. Thompson noticed his distraction. "Jamal," she said softly, sitting down beside him, "I know things have been hard lately, but your dad and I are just trying to do what's best for you." Jamal's grip tightened on his fork. "I know you are, Mom," he muttered, not meeting her eyes. "But sometimes, it feels like you're doing it for yourselves." Mrs. Thompson's eyes widened, hurt flashing across her face. "That's not true," she insisted. "We just want to make sure you're safe. We can't let them get away with what they did to you." Jamal remained silent, knowing that arguing would only make things worse. He forced himself to take a few bites, if only to stop her from worrying, before saying, "I'm just tired, Mom. I need some time to think." That afternoon, Mr. Thompson was back at Westbrook Academy for another meeting with the school's administration. His patience was wearing thin, and he was determined to force their hand this time. The principal's office was just as cold and unwelcoming as he remembered it, with its dark wood panels and neatly arranged plaques on the wall. Principal Harris greeted him with a tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming in again," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "I understand you're upset, but as I mentioned before, we need to follow proper procedures." Mr. Thompson cut her off, slamming a folder on her desk. "Enough with the procedures," he snapped. "I have evidence, Marcus Williams's journal, the video of my son being tormented, and now a witness willing to testify. If you don't take action, I'll take this to the media. Let's see how well your donors react and they hear about your school's dirty little secrets." Principal Harris's expression faltered for a moment, her eyes darting toward the closed door. "Mr. Thompson," she said, lowering her voice, "we don't want this to escalate further. I've been instructed by the board to offer a solution, one that will satisfy everyone involved." Mr. Thompson narrowed his eyes. "What kind of solution?" She slid an envelope across the desk, her hands shaking slightly. "This is a settlement," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "If you agree to drop the accusations and keep everything confidential, the school will cover all of Jamal's medical expenses and provide a substantial payout." Mr. Thompson stared at the envelope in disbelief, anger surging through him. "You think you can buy our silence?" he hissed. "My son nearly died, and you want me to sweep it under the rug for a few dollars?" "It's more than just a few dollars," she said, her tone desperate now. "This is the best way to protect your family, Mr. Thompson. If you go public, Tyler's father will destroy you. He has connections, he can ruin your career, your reputation, everything. Mr. Thompson's hands trembled with fury. "We're not for sale," he growled, pushing the envelope back toward her. "And if you think you can scare us into silence, you're wrong." He stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. As he made his way down the hallway, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Mrs. Thompson: "Jamal's missing. He's not at the hospital." Meanwhile, Jamal was making his way to the park where he had agreed to meet Logan. His heart raced with both fear and determination. He had told the nurses he was going for a short walk, knowing it was the only way to leave the hospital without alerting his parents. They would never have let him leave alone, especially after everything that had happened. When he reached the park, he saw Logan pacing nervously by the benches. Jamal approached cautiously, scanning the area to make sure they weren't being watched. "Logan," he called out softly. Logan turned, relief flooding his face. "Jamal, I'm glad you came," he said, his voice shaking. "We don't have much time. Tyler's dad found out that I gave your dad that video. He's furious." Jamal's stomach tightened. "What do you mean? What's he planning?" Logan glanced around again before leaning in closer. "He's going to frame you," Logan whispered. "He's already told the principal that you brought the larvae to school yourself as part of some sick prank. They're going to use it against you, say you did it for attention." Jamal's world tilted as he tried to process Logan's words. They can't do that," he stammered. "There's no proof." "They don't need proof," Logan said, his voice filled with despair. "Tyler's dad controls everything. He's already got the school board in his pocket. If your parents keep pushing, they'll make it look like you're the villain." Jamal's mind raced. He had to warn his parents, but he also couldn't let them get caught up in this any further. "Why are you telling me this, Logan?" Jamal asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I'm tired of being afraid," Logan admitted, his eyes shining with guilt. "I went along with Tyler because I didn't want to be his next target. But after what happened to you, I can't live with myself if I don't do something." Jamal nodded slowly. "We need to get more evidence," he said, determination hardening in his chest. "Something that proves Tyler's dad is behind all of this." Logan hesitated. "There's a file in Tyler's dad's office," he said. "It's got all the details of how they covered up past incidents. If we can get it, we can expose him." Jamal's heart pounded. "That's too dangerous. We can't." "We have to," Logan insisted, desperation in his eyes. "It's the only way to stop them." At that moment, Mrs. Thompson's car screeched to a halt at the entrance of the park. She had tracked Jamal's phone and arrived just in time to see him and Logan talking in hushed tones. She leaped out of the car, running toward them. "Jamal," she called, her voice filled with relief and panic. "What are you doing here?" Jamal turned, guilt washing over him. "Mom, I..." Before he could finish, Logan blurted out, "We're trying to stop them. Tyler's dad is planning to frame Jamal. We have to get the evidence." Mrs. Thompson's face paled as she listened. "Jamal, you can't do this alone," she said, grabbing his arm. "We need to go home. Now." "But Mom, we can end this," Jamal pleaded. "We have to do something, or they'll keep coming after us." Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears as she pulled Jamal into a tight embrace. "We will end it," she whispered. "But we'll do it together." As they hurried back to the car, Logan's warning still echoed in Jamal's mind. They were running out of time, and Tyler's father was closing in. But now, with his family by his side, Jamal knew he wasn't alone. And this time, they were ready to fight back. The tension in the Thompson household was palpable. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the once cozy, well-lit home now felt like a fortress under siege. Mr. Thompson stood in the living room, pacing restlessly, while Mrs. Thompson flipped through Marcus Williams's journal on the coffee table. Jamal sat on the couch, his hands trembling as he scrolled through messages from Logan on his phone. "We have to do this now," Mr. Thompson said, stopping to face his wife and son. "If we wait any longer, Tyler's father will have already put his plan in motion. The evidence Logan gave us won't be enough to stop him if he's already turning the narrative against Jamal." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes hardening with resolve. "I spoke with the journalist," she said. "They're ready to publish our story, but we need something concrete. That file in Mr. Anderson's office might be our last shot." Jamal looked up, fear and determination warring on his face. "Mom, Dad, if we do this, there's no going back. We're putting everything on the line." Mr. Thompson knelt in front of Jamal, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're not just doing this for you, Jamal," he said softly. "We're doing it for every kid who's been silenced by people like Tyler's father. We have to expose them." Jamal nodded slowly, his resolve solidifying. "Okay. But how do we get the file?" Logan said it's locked in a cabinet in his dad's home office. "There's no way we can just walk in and take it." Mrs. Thompson took a deep breath, revealing the plan she had been contemplating. "I know it's risky," she began, "but Logan said there's a charity gala at Tyler's house tomorrow night. It's for the school board members and their families. If we can get inside, we might have a chance to access his office while everyone is distracted." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened. "You're suggesting we break into his house during a gala? That's insane, Maria." "It's our only option," Mrs. Thompson insisted. "We can't wait for another opportunity, Mark. If we don't act now, Tyler's father will destroy everything we have." Jamal looked between his parents, his heart pounding in his chest. "I'll go," he said suddenly, his voice steady. "I know Logan. He trusts me. He can help me get in." "No, absolutely not," Mr. Thompson said firmly. "You've been through enough, Jamal. You're not getting involved in this any further." But Jamal shook his head, his eyes blazing with determination. "I have to do this, Dad. If I don't, they'll win. And I can't live with that." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "We'll go with you," she said, squeezing her son's hand. "We're in this together. But you have to promise to stay close to us. We can't lose you." Jamal nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Okay. We'll do it together." The next evening, the Thompsons arrived at the Anderson mansion dressed in formal attire borrowed from friends. The grand house was lit up like a palace, with guests streaming in through the front doors. Laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air as the Thompsons joined the crowd, trying to blend in. Jamal's heart raced as he scanned the room, searching for Logan. His palms were slick with sweat, and every fiber of his being was screaming at him to run. But he knew there was no turning back now. "Stick to the plan," Mr. Thompson whispered, leaning in close. "We have to act fast." Suddenly, Logan appeared at the edge of the room, catching Jamal's eye. He nodded subtly, signaling for them to follow him. The Thompsons wove their way through the crowd, keeping their heads down as they slipped into a side hallway. "This way," Logan whispered urgently. "My dad's office is down here, but we don't have much time." The group moved swiftly and silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Logan led them to a heavy oak door and pulled out a set of keys he had stolen earlier. With trembling hands, he unlocked the door and pushed it open. The office was dimly lit, filled with expensive furniture and framed awards. Mrs. Thompson immediately began rifling through the filing cabinets while Mr. Thompson stood guard at the door. Jamal hovered nervously, keeping watch as Logan fumbled with a desk drawer. "Hurry," Jamal urged, his voice a strained whisper. "We don't have much time." Mrs. Thompson's hands shook as she pulled out a thick folder labeled Confidential, Legal Settlements. Her eyes widened as she flipped through the pages, finding documents detailing payments to silence other victims, including Marcus Williams's family. "This is it," she whispered, holding up the files. "This proves everything." But just as they were about to leave, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mr. Thompson's heart leapt into his throat. "We've got company," he hissed. "We need to go, now." Logan's face went pale. "That's my dad," he whispered, panic filling his voice. "He must have noticed I was missing." Thinking quickly, Jamal grabbed the folder from his mother's hands and stuffed it into his jacket. "I'll create a distraction," he said. "You guys get out of here." "No, Jamal, you can't," Mrs. Thompson began, but Jamal was already slipping out of the office. Jamal's heart pounded as he hurried down the hallway, his mind racing for a way to distract Tyler's father. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with Mr. Anderson himself. The older man's eyes narrowed, recognizing Jamal instantly. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Anderson demanded, his voice cold and dangerous. Jamal forced himself to stay calm, flashing a defiant smile. "Just enjoying the party," he said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Nice place you've got." Mr. Anderson's expression darkened, and he took a menacing step forward. "I don't know how you got in here, but you'd better leave before I call security." "I'm not going anywhere," Jamal shot back, his hands trembling behind his back. "I know what you did, and soon everyone else will too." Before Mr. Anderson could react, the sound of a fire alarm blared through the mansion. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Logan must have set it off as a distraction. In the chaos that ensued, Jamal took off running, dodging guests and staff as they scrambled for the exits. He pushed through the crowded hallway, desperate to reach his parents. Back in the car, Mrs. Thompson clutched the folder to her chest, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Mr. Thompson glanced in the rearview mirror, his eyes scanning the road for any sign of pursuit. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said grimly. "But at least we have what we need." Jamal leaned back in his seat, his heart still racing. He had never been so scared in his life, but he also felt something he hadn't felt in weeks: hope. "We're going to bring them down," he said quietly, meeting his parents' eyes. "For Marcus, and for everyone else they've hurt." Mrs. Thompson reached over and squeezed his hand. "Yes, we will," she said, her voice filled with a fierce determination. "And we won't stop until justice is served." As the car sped away into the night, the Thompsons knew the battle was far from over. But for the first time, they had the upper hand, and they were ready to take the fight to Tyler's father. The early morning sunlight streamed into the Thompson living room, where stacks of papers, USB drives, and laptops cluttered the once tidy space. Jamal, still groggy from a fitful sleep, joined his parents at the dining table. The tension in the air was thick, but underneath it was a current of determination. "This is it, Mr. Thompson said, clicking through the files they had gathered. "We have everything we need. The video evidence, Marcus Williams's journal entries, and now, the documents proving the school's cover-ups. We need to get this to the press before they realize what we've found." Mrs. Thompson nodded, her eyes filled with steely resolve. "I've already called the journalist," she said. "They're going to meet us at their office this afternoon. Once this hits the news, the Andersons won't be able to silence it." Jamal leaned back, his heart still racing from the events of the previous night. His body ached from exhaustion, but he knew they had to act quickly. Tyler's father would stop at nothing to protect his family, and they were running on borrowed time. As they gathered their evidence and prepared to leave, Jamal's phone buzzed. It was another message from Logan. "Be careful. My dad knows you took the files." He's furious and said he's going to shut you down. Jamal's stomach tightened, but he didn't have time to dwell on the warning. They had to move fast if they wanted to get ahead of whatever Mr. Anderson was planning. The drive to the journalist's office was tense and silent. Jamal stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. Everything had led to this moment. He couldn't shake the fear that somehow, it would all fall apart. As they pulled into the parking lot, Mrs. Thompson turned to him and gave a reassuring smile. "We're almost there, sweetheart. Just a little longer." Mr. Thompson parked the car, and they hurried inside the building. The journalist, Rebecca Martin, was waiting for them in a small, cluttered office. She was a seasoned reporter with a reputation for exposing corruption, and she had been intrigued by the evidence the Thompsons had hinted at. "Thank you for coming," Rebecca said, shaking their hands. "I've cleared my afternoon for this. Let's see what you've got." Mr. Thompson handed her the folder filled with documents, as well as a USB drive containing the video and scanned pages from Marcus's journal. "This is everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We have proof that Tyler Anderson and his father covered up multiple cases of bullying, harassment, and even a suicide." Rebecca's eyes widened as she skimmed through the papers and watched snippets of the video. "This is damning," she muttered. "If this is all verified, it could blow the lid off the school board." Mrs. Thompson nodded. "We need this story to go public as soon as possible. The Andersons are already trying to cover their tracks, and if we wait too long, they'll bury it." Rebecca looked up, her eyes sharp and focused. "I'll start writing the story immediately, but I need to confirm a few details with my sources. I'll also need statements from you and Jamal." Jamal's heart pounded as Rebecca turned to him. "Jamal, are you ready to go on the record?" she asked gently. He swallowed hard, his palms sweaty, but he nodded. "Yes, I am. I want people to know what really happened." As they wrapped up their statements and Rebecca started drafting the article, the office door suddenly burst open. A group of men in suits stormed in, led by none other than Mr. Anderson himself. His face was a mask of cold fury. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Anderson spat, glaring at the Thompsons. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Rebecca stood her ground, her expression unflinching. "Mr. Anderson, this is a private meeting. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." But Mr. Anderson wasn't deterred. He turned his icy gaze on Jamal. "You think you can ruin my family's reputation with these lies?" He sneered. "You have no idea the kind of power you're up against." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about your reputation, Mr. Anderson. It's about justice for all the children you've hurt." Mr. Anderson's eyes narrowed, and he pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket. "Take this," he said, thrusting it toward Mr. Thompson. "Consider it a generous settlement. Drop the story, and you'll never have to worry about money again." Mr. Thompson's eyes blazed with fury. "We're not for sale," he said, pushing the envelope away. "Your money won't erase what you've done." Before Mr. Anderson could respond, Rebecca held up her phone. "I've been recording this entire conversation," she said calmly. "Anything you say here can and will be used in my report." Mr. Anderson's face went pale, his mask of confidence slipping. He turned to his entourage, barking orders. "We're leaving. But this isn't over." As he stormed out, the Thompsons let out a collective breath they didn't realize they had been holding. Rebecca smiled, shaking her head. "He just handed me the final piece I needed," she said. "This story is going live tonight." That evening, the story broke across multiple news outlets. The headline read, "Elite School Board Member Exposed, Corruption, Cover UPS, and Abuse Allegations Rock Westbrook Academy." The article detailed everything: the cover-ups, the bribes, Marcus Williams's tragic story, and the recent attack on Jamal. It included statements from the Thompsons, Jamal's testimony, and even snippets from the secretly recorded conversation with Mr. Anderson. As the news spread, social media exploded with outrage. Parents demanded answers from the school board, and former students came forward with their own stories of bullying and abuse that had been ignored. The Thompsons watched the coverage from their living room, their hands tightly clasped together. Jamal's heart swelled with relief as he saw the flood of support pouring in. For the first time in months, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. But just as they started to relax, Mr. Thompson's phone rang. It was Logan. "Jamal, you need to listen," Logan said urgently. "My dad, he's desperate. He's not going to let this go. He's planning to sue your family for defamation." Jamal's eyes widened in shock. "What? But everything in the article is true." "It doesn't matter," Logan said, his voice filled with fear. "He's not going to back down. He'll drag you through the courts to ruin you." Mr. Thompson overheard the conversation and took the phone. "Logan, thank you for warning us. But we're not afraid of him anymore. We have the truth on our side." As Mr. Thompson hung up, he turned to his family, determination etched in his face. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. But we've already come too far to back down now." Mrs. Thompson nodded, squeezing Jamal's hand. "Whatever happens next, we'll face it together," she said. Jamal nodded, a spark of hope lighting in his chest. They had exposed the truth, and no matter what Mr. Anderson threw at them next, they were ready to fight back. As the night deepened, the Thompson family stood united, knowing that the battle was far from over, but also knowing that they had already won something far more important, their courage and their voices. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the Thompson household. For the first time in months, there was a feeling of cautious optimism in the air. The tension that had weighed them down had lifted slightly, replaced with a sense of resolve. Though they knew the battle wasn't completely over, there was a collective feeling that they had finally gained the upper hand. Jamal sat at the kitchen table, sipping a cup of herbal tea. His eyes were still tired, but there was a hint of a smile on his face. The past few days had been a whirlwind of media coverage, legal threats, and overwhelming support from people who had read their story. The messages of encouragement had been a lifeline, reminding him that he wasn't alone. Mrs. Thompson walked into the kitchen, her face softening when she saw Jamal. "How are you feeling today, honey?" she asked, reaching out to gently stroke his back. "Better," Jamal admitted, taking another sip of his tea. "I still can't believe how many people have reached out. It's kind of amazing." Mrs. Thompson nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. "You've inspired a lot of people, Jamal. You stood up when it would have been easier to stay silent. I'm proud of you." Jamal's smile widened a little, the warmth of his mother's words soothing the lingering wounds in his heart. "I couldn't have done it without you and Dad," he said quietly. "You never gave up on me, even when I wanted to." At that moment, Mr. Thompson entered the kitchen, carrying a stack of newspapers. "The story is still trending," he announced, spreading the papers out on the table. "The school board is in complete disarray. Parents are demanding resignations. Mr. Anderson hasn't been seen in public since the article was published." Jamal's eyes flickered over the headlines. Words like, "cover-up exposed," "school board scandal," and "victims speak out," jumped out at him. It was surreal to see his family's fight for justice splashed across the front pages, but it also brought a sense of closure. "I never thought we'd get this far," Jamal admitted, shaking his head. "I was so scared that no one would believe us." "But they did," Mrs. Thompson said, squeezing his shoulder. "And now, we can finally start to move on." Later that afternoon, the family drove back to Westbrook Academy. The school board had finally relented under the pressure and had agreed to meet with the Thompsons and the families of other victims. As they walked through the familiar front gates, Jamal felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, relief, and a newfound sense of strength. The meeting was held in a large conference room filled with concerned parents, school board members, and a few reporters. Principal Harris looked pale and defeated, her confident demeanor from earlier meetings completely shattered. Mr. Anderson was conspicuously absent, a clear indication that he was trying to avoid further scrutiny. As the Thompsons took their seats, the board president stood and cleared his throat. "We want to start by apologizing for the pain and suffering caused to the students of this school," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We failed to protect those in our care, and we will be conducting a thorough investigation to ensure this never happens again." Jamal's hands clenched into fists under the table, anger still simmering just below the surface. But when he looked at his parents, their calm, supportive presence steadied him. This was the justice they had fought for, not just for him, but for all the others who had been silenced. The board president continued, "We are also announcing the immediate resignation of Mr. Anderson from the school board. His actions do not reflect the values of Westbrook Academy, and we will cooperate fully with any legal investigations." There was a murmur of approval from the room. Mrs. Thompson squeezed Jamal's hand, a small smile on her lips. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a start.